Okay, let's talk about Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes, The Materialist Philosophy, and it says political Leviathan there, but I want to emphasize his ethical egoism. As it happens, you cannot really separate Thomas Hobbes' political philosophy from his moral philosophy, his philosophy of moral obligation. So I will have words to say about both while, of course, laying stress and emphasis upon his moral philosophy. So let's think about the transition from what we just studied to what we are beginning to study now. So let's talk about the big takeaways from Aquinas and transition into Hobbes. The first big takeaway from Aquinas is that philosophical ethics requires three levels of analysis. First, there's an analysis of the basic goods acknowledged by all morally healthy people, should be a D in there. Second, an analysis of the natural law or rules that foster virtue, that's a good of the soul, civil peace, that's an external good. And in a word, all of the basic goods, that is, the natural law promotes all of the basic goods. Third, we require an analysis, a detailed analysis of the virtues themselves. Though indeed the virtues are already implicit in the basic goods under letter A, this analysis of the virtues is a special object of attention for the moral philosopher. And in the history of philosophy, I believe St. Thomas far and away assigns the greatest number of pages to various analyses of the virtues. It's the most extensive virtue ethics ever worked out, and it's something of a travesty that people don't study it more carefully today. They just reduce him to a natural law theorist, as I mentioned earlier in the course. So philosophical ethics for Thomas presupposes a philosophical anthropology, second point here, a central part of which concerns an analysis of the passions, and I hope you take pains to commit that doctrine of the passions to memory, because I believe it will serve you well going forward in life, and you can become conscious of the place of fear in its relation to confidence, and the relation of hope, or hope in relation to despair, and that you can distinguish between fear and despair, and not to mention those two, but also aversion, which is not the same thing as either of those two, right? And begin to get a purchase on your emotional life, as we say today, or on your passions, and begin to control them. Now, there are two ways of controlling your passions. Number one is simply to strike it down. That's the kind of direct, brutal way. And the second is to just pause, breathe, and think about the situation and describe it in accurate terms. Most of the time, when you're getting excited, you're exaggerating the significance of what just happened or what is happening. 99 times out of 100. Okay, so 3. Philosophical ethics presupposes natural theology, that is, demonstrations that God exists, that he is pure goodness, that he loves human beings who are made in his image, and that he is the author of the natural law. Now, Aquinas thinks he can demonstrate all of that without the Bible. So this makes Aquinas a representative of theistic supernaturalism. Let's remind ourselves, Stoicism represented theistic naturalism, and Plato represented atheistic supernaturalism. That one surprises people, but that's true. 4th, philosophical ethics is but a part of the larger project of moral theology for Aquinas. The hard virtues of justice, fortitude, and temperance are unified at a higher level with the milder virtues imparted by grace of faith, hope, love, patience, humility, and kindness, not to mention others. So yeah, we inherit these hard virtues from Greek and Roman antiquity, and then the milder Christian virtues, while preserving those hard virtues, supervene upon them and produce a more perfect moral product, as it were, specimen. 5th, and this is really a new point and takes us beyond Aquinas, Thomas Hobbes will be the first representative of atheistic naturalism, right? So there were 4 basic metaphysical positions, and now we finally have a philosopher representing this one here, atheistic naturalism. Or at least I claim he's an atheist, though he at times claims to be a believer, but I'll explain why I think he's an atheist. Note that it took until the late 16th century for Aquinas' Summa Theologiae to become adopted as the standard textbook in the Roman Catholic Church. While Hobbes was no Catholic, he was steeped in the Christian Aristotelianism perfected by Aquinas. So Hobbes for all intents and purposes, is attacking Aquinas. So it's appropriate to say, oh, he's 300 years later. It's a big leap. Not so much. Aquinas was he was the textbook of the Catholic Church at the time Hobbes was alive, and he himself had to wrestle with Aquinas, and he particularly had to wrestle with Aristotelianism, or Christian Aristotelianism, of which Aquinas was the greatest representative. Let's talk about Hobbes. A little biographical note. He was born in 1588, the year the English defeated the Spanish Armada. He died in 1679, 10 years prior to the conclusion of the Glorious Revolution, which permanently installed Protestant-led government in England and subsequently Great Britain. Hobbes maintained that he was born prematurely due to his mother's great fear of the coming invasion by the Spanish Armada under Philip II, great Catholic monarch. In fact, who failed in his mission, right? In fact, many had prophesied. In all periods of Christian civilization, there were always people obsessed with the apocalypse, prophesying that it's about to happen, right? So it's no less true it's no less true today as it is then, or as it was then. In fact, many had prophesied that 1588 would mark the end of the world, and this view was backed by numbers drawn from the book of the Apocalypse itself. Some people call it the book of Revelations, the book of Daniel, and from Isaiah. Okay, but perhaps one can say that not the world, but not the world, but a world ended in July of 1588. What came to an end? There was still the live possibility of Mary Catholic England being restored. If Philip II's Armada conquered England and then set up a sort of Catholic puppet regime, or at least a Catholic monarch who would gradually, over decades, gain a dynasty that would over decades gain independence. Had he succeeded at that, Mary Catholic England would have made a comeback. It didn't happen, right? There was a great storm, and the Spanish Armada was destroyed. So the world of Catholic England and its Mary quality is simply passed into the annals of history. What followed, perhaps, was more dour, severe, melancholic, and perhaps even wrathful, at least a touch. However one describes the transition, there was indeed a transformation. And historians to this day are obsessed with this transition from Mary Catholic England to Protestant England. They want to capture what's happened there, and persons in England and Britain more broadly, they're very concerned with this thing, which they, following the Russians perhaps, or at least parallel to the Russians, call the English soul, right? And they kind of wring their hands over the long Catholic history of England. Long history. The Catholic Church there was dominant for at least 1,000 years. And 1,000 years, guys, that's a long time, right? Before they turned to their peculiar mode of Protestantism. And even their mode of Protestantism, in one mode, they call it High Anglicanism, looks still rather like the Catholic Church, only without the Pope. So Thomas Hobbes, having entered the world due to apocalyptic fear, came to base his moral and political philosophy on that very passion, fear, as we will see. He described fear as his twin, born with him out of the womb of his mother. Okay, so these biographical notes lend color to our study of a philosopher. Let's see here. Looking forward in Hobbes' life, the most important event was no doubt the English Civil War, which raged from 1641 through 1651 and ended with the decapitation, unfortunately, of King Charles by Parliament. Okay, this would be as if the U.S. Congress ordered and itself carried out the execution of Joe Biden or Donald Trump. Because the English Civil War was a war between the Parliament and the King. So now, what if Congress got together and organized a war against? Again, actually, conservatives today maintain that the alphabet agencies, effectively the DOJ and FBI and so on and so forth, did wage a kind of war and even an attempted coup against Donald Trump between 2016 and they tried to finish the job up until he just got reelected I'm not going to evaluate that claim. I'm just giving you a little bit of contemporary history and telling you that is how they're talking. You tune into the guy Steve Bannon with the crazy hairdo. He says that every single episode. Okay, so you can confirm what I just said on your own. So now for the English, killing a king would have been regarded as worse, as the king was thought to be appointed by God himself. Now, Oliver Cromwell, a Puritan, assumed in effect dictatorial power once Charles was killed. Now, Cromwell didn't really want dictatorial power, but he was kind of maneuvered back into it. And once he had it, he wielded it certainly. So the experience of war was a second factor, confirming Hobbes' conviction that fear is the fundamental passion and the key to understanding both human nature and to establishing a just commonwealth. Okay, so fear is the fundamental passion for Hobbes. All right. Now he will say that there's only one good thing in life, and that is pleasure. And fear doesn't have anything to do with pleasure. Fear has to do with escaping annihilation. In the final analysis, he'll connect those two things. So you want to preserve yourself in comfort, like with pleasure, right? So we'll get to that. It is for his political philosophy, as recorded in his Leviathan, that Hobbes is justly famous. Nonetheless, we will here study the ethical theory that stands in the background of that political philosophy. This is the theory called ethical egoism. So Hobbes was influenced by an Italian named Machiavelli, whose life I studied a bit. Read a book on him, and I read his major treatises. Machiavelli, the important thing to recognize about him is that relative to Plato, to Aristotle, and St. Thomas Aquinas, he rejects this distinction between the wise few and the unwise many. At least he doesn't put it to any direct political use. It's in the background, 100% is in the background. But what he does, he replaces it with a distinction between those who desire to command and oppress, people who just want to run for high office and take power and just tell other people what to do and have their names reported in history books, and everyone else who desire merely not to be commanded or oppressed. That's you and me. I mean, that's most of us. Some of my students want to command and oppress people. Most of you just want to be left alone, go home on the weekend, enjoy backyard barbecue with your friends and your kids and whatnot, right? That's the basic distinction. Forget about the wise and the unwise, because the wise don't want to command and oppress. They're not going to bother seeking rule. Do you follow? Okay. What matters is the people who are going to go after power and those who will not. And we have to work out, we have to calibrate the relation between these two populations. What here, like 3% of the species and 97% over here. So the first are motivated by honor, what Hobbes calls vainglory. Okay, they demand definite signs of their superiority over others. All right. Christianity, which teaches gentleness, tenderness of affection, and sacrificial love, charges them with pride and makes exceptions for people like Philip II on the one hand and St. Louis, right, like our city, Pius Louis IX. He's a saint in the Catholic Church, or Blessed Karl, the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, Austrian emperor, I believe, deposed once and for all in 1926. So I have the right year. So the second group are motivated, that is you and me, are motivated by the desire for comfortable self-preservation. Here we have those two things: self-preservation, right, which is sought mainly from the passion of fear, and comfort from desire. So desire and fear cooperate in the life of all persons. Now, the persons who desire to command and oppress, they're not very fearful. They're willing to go out and fight. All right, and thus many of them die in mortal combat. And as far as comfort, well, I guess they want some comfort as well, but they're willing to sacrifice that for power and for honor. Okay. So human experiences teach us that there's actually a third category that Machiavelli and Hobbes miss, but I'm going to point it out to you so you don't. I want to inoculate you against a limited way of looking at things. So this third category are those who desire neither superiority, right, nor equality, nor mere equality, but rather pursue a more and more perfect consciousness of two things. First, the degree to which sin has made them wretched, we are living, in a kind of dilapidated Christian civilization. But it is Christian civilization, so you have to understand where you're standing, guys. All right, and there's a lot of people like this. I've thought about this. I'd say there are about 20, 30 million actual devout Christians left in this country. That's a pretty good number. All right, I mean, people who are really concerned with this, sin and wretchedness and being a wretched sinner. The second thing they're concerned with is the inexhaustible ocean of divine mercy. All right, so and we have 20 or 30 million people. That's a political force. You have to take them into account. You don't just have this one distinction up here. So this group would prefer to suffer for Christ as a confirmation and seal of their devotion to him than to seek the consolations of the world. And so I would guess that there, I don't know, I'll just say well more than 100 million Christians are kind of, I don't want to point fingers, but they're not living up to the doctrine. They're not living by what I just described here. They say they're Christian, but they're pursuing a prosperity gospel or something of that sort. If you just worship Jesus, he'll make you rich or something like that. I know I must sound a little bit dismissive, but I have to be brief right now because we're talking about Hobbes. So allow that to stand. Hobbes does treat of Christianity in parts 3 and 4 of his Leviathan, but the treatment there is made in light of the distinction drawn from Machiavelli, while the reality of saintly persons is passed like Saint Teresa, right? Who was the woman from Calcutta who maintained all of the hospitals, so on and so forth? Well, her name isn't coming to mind. She's like one of those famous people of the 20th century. John Paul II sainted her. Really, one of those famous people of the 20th century. So I'm drawing a blank on one of the most famous people ever, really. Mother Teresa. Yeah, that's it. Mother Teresa. It was Teresa. Okay, so it took me so long to remember her name, I forgot what point I wanted to make in that connection. So I'll leave that, since I can't remember what I wanted to say. Maybe it'll come back. So Hobbes' interpretation of Scripture is likely peculiarly materialist in its basic premises. In a word, Hobbes continued. Now, we haven't gotten into this in this course, but Machiavelli was enacting a revolt against Christianity. My thesis is that Hobbes was actually continuing. Okay, I said he passes over the reality of saintly persons. Mother Teresa is, for us, is an example, obvious example of a saintly person. My mother-in-law met her. Now, my mother-in-law is a hardened journalist, a cynic. She's as hard as granite. When she walked into the room where Mother Teresa was standing, she was blown back by a force of goodness. That's how she put it. Like there was something coming off of Mother Teresa that caused her to step back. Okay, so you can evaluate that. So Hobbes' transformation of Christian society, I'm going to make short work of this. What he's basically doing is trying to get rid of all this talk about the end times and the Antichrist and heaven and hell, death, judgment, heaven and hell. So trying to turn our eyes away from things above this world, like seek ye the things of heaven. He said, no, don't worry about the things of heaven too much. Worry about the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Do not have others do unto you. Do not do unto others as you would not have others do unto you. So there are two formulations, a positive one and a negative one, right? And if you live by that golden rule, we're going to achieve the one thing we can actually achieve in his mind, because he's an atheist. I'll try to prove that. And that is comfortable self-preservation, like we're a group of beavers or wolves or something. So here we go. Basic features of his philosophy. Materialism. Hobbes represents a resurgence of ancient Epicureanism. That is, he believes that all that exists are atoms in the void. We'll get back to that. Now he introduces egoism, which we'll comment on further in the next page. This is how he describes it. Of voluntary actions of every man, the object is some good to himself. That's it. This is really a doctrine concerning motivation. What can get you up off your chair and moving around? For the egoist, Hobbes is one, a person can only be motivated by a desire or appetite for some good for himself, and never simply for the sake of another's good, right? We'll get to altruism in the next page. Hobbes also adopts a mathematical method. Science should model itself on geometrical demonstration from definitions. All right, so like in your, I don't know if you've done many theorems or proved any theorems in your math courses. You tend to engage more in problem solving for X and stuff like that. But one of the main things that mathematicians do is not really, solve for X, but actually prove things. Okay, now that's what Hobbes was interested in. He adopted that model for philosophy. I'll leave it at that. Nominalism. This is a doctrine that there are no real universals. So there's you, there's your mom, your dad, your friend. What's the same between all of you? Well, that's your humanity. And according to Plato, at least, and in a certain way Aristotle and Aquinas, the humanity in you, your mom, your dad, and your friend is the same humanity. Okay? It's only distributed between 4 different instances, and indeed it's distributed across 8 billion instances of persons who are alive at the moment, and many others who died in a certain respect. But he says that doesn't really exist. All we have are a bunch of particulars. There's you, there's your mom, your dad, your friend, and 8 billion other people, and there's no common nature. There's this, this human, a second human, and there's a name, human being, that we apply to all these particulars, and that's that. Likewise with tree and dog. That's nominalism. Okay. No common natures, just common names. So now let's get back to this business of psychological egoism, altruism, and communitarianism. So there are 3 types of theory of moral motivation. Okay, so we have to be careful here, because there's the theory of motivation, and then there's a theory of how you ought to live. Okay, theory of motivation has to do with psychology, rational psychology or philosophical psychology. How you ought to live has to do with philosophical ethics. Let's keep these things distinct. Now, psychological egoism affirms that it is only possible for an agent to be motivated by a desire for his or her own good. Maybe you want to be motivated by a desire for somebody else's good. Can't happen. You're not wired that way, according to the psychological egoist. Psychological altruism affirms that it is possible for an agent to be motivated by a desire either for his or her own or for another's good. So they say or for another's, right? That means you can consider another person. Maybe you find her moral conduct to be inherently attractive and rather beautiful, and you just feel moved to do something good for the person. Psychological communitarianism, this is my phrase, but I've seen a number of discussions that they basically arrived at this concept without saying it. So psychological communitarianism affirms that it is possible for an agent to be motivated by a desire for the good of a group of which that agent is a member. Okay? Now, you say, well, that's just a kind of egoism because that's his group, right? So he's just benefiting himself. Nope, because he can very often he'll pursue this up to the point of self-destruction. So that's not ethical egoism if you're willing to more or less be reduced to a lifeless corpse for your group. And of course, normally, if you're going to benefit your group, that normally entails self-benefit. Right? I'm benefiting my group right now by educating you people, and I'm doing my very, very modest part to hold our society together. And hopefully, this will help you folks. And you'll go out and work harder and do a good job. And when I show up at your restaurant, you'll do a decent job cooking the food. My kids will get fed, right? That sort of thing. So it normally entails self-benefit, which is why it is not strictly identical with psychological altruism either. It's not altruism. It's not egoism. It's communitarianism. Okay? That's what it is. Now, how about the ethical? Oh, look at that. I have psychological in there. Got to fix that. Sorry. What I'm going to do, as you watch me, this is how the sausages are made. This is the part you're not supposed to see, right? So here we go. That in there, like that. Put this over here like this. I'll teach you guys how to be a philosophy teacher. There you go. And then you see, so slideshow from current slide. It's going to come back in just a sec. So there are 3 types of corresponding ethical theories. So there's ethical egoism. This affirms that one ought to, it's a key word there, be motivated only by a desire for his or her own good. So maybe you can be motivated by a desire for some other person's good, but if you did that, you'd be acting irrationally and therefore immorally. You should only act for your own good. Okay? It might sound crazy to you, it might even sound Might even sound like a round square, as I like to say. You know, ethical egoism. You know, I thought ethics is about taking into consideration the good of other people, right, and your community. But anyways, some people think they can make this float. So I wish them luck. Second is ethical altruism. This affirms that one ought to be motivated, drop the it there, one ought to be motivated when appropriate by a desire for another's good, right? You can't be motivated by a desire for other person's good at all times, or maybe you can. You can be filled with love. Yeah, we get back to saints. There's some persons who claim to have more or less been filled with love at others for all times. Okay, so ethical communitarianism affirms that one ought to be motivated when appropriate by a desire for the good of a group of which the agent is a member with the same qualifications. So Hobbes was an atomist, again, to mention that fact again. That means that he taught that the basic unit of being was a tiny material atom. And for him, there are an infinite number of these tiny units of being, okay? All animals, humans included, are composed of atoms. So you're composed of atoms. I mean, it's a rather current theory, right? So people still believe a more complexified version of this. Such composition produces a self-preservation machine. That's what you are. So you're sort of a radically individualistic by nature, because that's what you are, a self-preservation machine. By nature, put yourself first, and you can't not put yourself first. Okay, we'll get back to that. So this means that the first end of human existence is self-preservation. Self-preservation is nonetheless a means to a higher end, namely comfort. Okay, so self-preservation is the first end. Once you have that covered, you're not done. You want to live not in pain, but in comfort. So you'll prefer comfort over pain, and comfort is your second end. So comfort is, what is comfort? Comfort is a preponderance of pleasure over pain. All right. Hence, the moral end of human life is comfortable self-preservation. And one ought to act so as to maximize the probability of enjoying it for yourself, because this is egoism. And he will argue that the best way to accomplish this by the lights of ethical egoism is to practice the golden rule. Okay, we'll get to that. Some of you are thinking, okay, he's an ethical egoist, so you go out there and steal a car, you know, do whatever you need to get by. He says that the exact opposite. Do not steal a car. Don't even be rude to people. The best way of enjoying comfortable self-preservation is by making your contribution consistently and without any failing in this regard. Make your contribution to social order and civil peace, and then the result will be a sharpened increase, heightened probability of enjoying what you really want, which is a comfortable life. Okay. So he rejects St. Thomas Aquinas and Scotus. It probably is the most important thing for our purposes here, so we'll skip this. He argues with Aquinas that all knowledge is derived from sensation. But he goes further in maintaining that our sensations are results of mechanical forces, sending motions from things into our bodies and terminating at the brain and heart, each of which resists the pressure put upon it. I mean, this is not much different from what we believe today. You know, we just updated the vocabulary, or observations are more precise, or theories are more sophisticated, but it's all the same ballpark. The result of this resistance to external pressure, a slight pushing back, as it were, is sensation. So imagination is the lingering of sensations after the moment of impact and the diminution of their intensity, right? So if you could imagine a horse right now is because there actually was a horse, maybe an image on a TV that impressed itself upon your eyeball and then hit the back of your retina, and that had some kind of influence over your optic nerve, which then sent an image into your brain. And now you're not looking at the horse at the moment, at least I don't think you are, and you're nonetheless able to summon that image back. And that's how it works. It's sort of a faded impression that you got through direct experience. All right. Understanding, by which he means judgment and reasoning, is but a certain development of the imagination by means of language. And this is what distinguishes us from brute beasts. You know, for a lot of Hobbes' Leviathan, it looks like he's more or less trying to erase the distinction between human and animal, but then he does grant that even if we're animals, we're a very special type of animal, a reasoning animal. Okay, but for him, language comes with a pitfall, namely that it allows our species to produce nonsense. He thinks incorporeal substance is nonsense. He doesn't tell us why that's nonsense, but he just thinks it's nonsense. Animals cannot produce nonsense, so that's the advantage of being an animal. All right, so I don't think we have to go into his philosophy of language. I'll send you this PowerPoint document. You can read those slides on your own if you want. He gives us an account of the origin of religion. The important thing to take away from this is that he's a skeptic about religion. Look at the fourth point. Religion is held to consist in four things. Belief in ghosts, right? Not very respectful right there. Ignorance of secondary causes, that is, the lack of scientific explanation of things. Not very respectful there. Devotion to the spirits feared. Okay, so fear works its way in. And taking of arbitrary connections as prognosticating the future, that is, trying to predict the future. Okay, and that's what he thinks it boils down to. He also elsewhere says that a religion is that worship which the sovereign authority permits or prescribes, and superstition is that which is outlawed. Okay, so that means in England at his time, Christianity was religion and Islam was a superstition. But in the Ottoman Empire of his time, today Turkey, Islam was religion and Christianity a superstition. So it's a kind of relativism about the nature of religion, which means he's not really a Christian. He would have gotten into trouble in those days had he just come out and said it, but he lets you infer it from his text. Okay, ethics and political philosophy. So Hobbes argued for what we might term a liberal autocracy. How do those two things fit together? Okay, so if you have a monarch with absolute authority who creates a free space and holds open a free space of economic activity and choice, not freedom of religion, Hobbes doesn't want any of that. He wants there to be one religion, but within that society, beneath the monarch, persons should engage in the arts and crafts. Remember, at that time, they didn't have, this is prior to industrialization, right? They didn't have factories like we think of factories. They had shops with a master artisan and journeyman, not the old guild system, right? Quite different. But he wanted these persons to be quite productive. So that's the liberal part. The autocracy part is that there's a monarch with absolute power, okay? And the benefit here for the monarch is that by letting people be industrious, he becomes wealthy. And typically when people are, at least historically, maybe not so much today in the United States and in Western powers, or quasi, states that have imitated Western powers like Japan and Singapore, typically, historically, when states became wealthy, they'd have lots of kids, because historically people wanted to have kids. We throw our kids into the garbage can, but historically people wanted to have them. And so the monarch would get to draft the kids, the children, particularly the sons, of course. They wouldn't draft women. And he would send the sons into battle, and they would take territory for him, and he would get wealthier. That's what he wants. In the meantime, the people they get what they want. They despite the frequent wars, on average, they enjoy a much greater probability of leading a long and comfortable life, relatively speaking. Right? The alternative to that is chaos. All right. So the monarch belongs to the category of those who seek vainglory, while the people are timid. But they can enter into a mutually beneficial symbiotic relationship. We must now explain the argument that he uses to justify this conception. Okay, so his, like I said, his ethics and political philosophy flow side by side. So we'll put a little bit of time into this political philosophy. So his argument begins in Leviathan 13, where he argues first for two different sorts of equality. First, there is, despite initial appearances to the contrary, a natural physical equality that obtains between all human beings. Okay, so a 90-pound, 90-year-old woman is the physical equal of Shaquille O'Neal. And some of you are saying that's preposterous. He says it's true, right? What is the equality consistent? Because that 90-pound, 90-year-old woman can sneak up saunter up to Shaquille O'Neal, who probably find her charming or amusing in some way, holding a poisoned needle, okay, and stick that thing in his leg, and that's the end of him. So what's equal? Well, I don't want this to happen to Mr. O'Neal. It seems like a decent guy, as far as things go. What this boils down to is that we're all equally vulnerable. That's the key word there. We're all equally vulnerable to suffering a violent death. You get that? That's where the fear comes in. Size and strength are irrelevant here, particularly when we have poisons and firearms and things of that sort. So technology is a great equalizer, of course, right? Okay, so, and this is the fundamental experience Hobbes is depending upon to motivate his philosophy and to get you to agree with him, that it's the fear of violent death, which is the most powerful passion a person can experience, more powerful than the passion of love, right? I don't know about that, but that seems to be his claim, right? I mean, there are persons who, how about the sexual passion? There are persons who will get in a plane and fly, you know, to Siberia if they think that there's some kind of gratification, you know, waiting for them, as if there aren't people around here, right? And it's not like we're a virtuous society sexually. I mean, people are ready and willing, right? So, well, why are you getting in the plane and flying off to Siberia? But if that's what you want, but that is how people live. So that's a pretty powerful passion too. But Hobbes, sort of thing you can't really prove by putting these things under a microscope. Maybe in a psychology lab, they could, you know, measure the intensity of these feelings, so on and so forth. I'll ask a psychologist one day. So Hobbes believes that the fear of violent death is the most powerful of the passions. It's not an arbitrary thesis, obviously, right? No one would want to be one of the people dispatched in a slasher flick, you know, that Jason guy with the mask, or any of those serial killers they depict in these films. Nobody wants that. As a matter of fact, everyone has a very strong aversion in the opposite direction. If they think there's someone like that hanging out, like on campus or something, boom, they're gone, right? Unless they wisely think they can hunker down in one spot and be okay. By the way, you've learned that if there's a shooter on CCRI, you get out of there as soon as you can. You don't stay in one spot. All right. So second, there is a natural equality of intelligence based in more or less equal experience, bestowing equal understanding in equal time. So we're all equal physically. We're also equal in wisdom, and I can confirm that's the case because I've met people in many different industries. I worked in a prison. I worked in trucking. I worked at UPS for a bit. I'm teaching again. Yeah, you give people enough experience after about 20 years. The guy may have been a knucklehead when he was 18. By 38. Either he's gotten it together or he's dead or he's homeless, okay? I mean, by 38, you have to figure things out. Everyone gets hit in the head with a few 2x4s, and they think hard after they have those experiences, and most people get it together, and they sound relatively wise by the age of 40. Relatively, right? I'm not saying they're about to win a Nobel Peace Prize or something, but most persons are relatively sensible by the age of 40. I drew this conclusion on the basis of interviewing, at this point, thousands of people. So here we go. The effects of equality. The first effect of universal equality is equality of hope. All right, so we're all equal in these two respects, so we are all equally hopeful. I think back to Aquinas. He apparently knew Aquinas' psychology, right? We're all equally hopeful to gain the things that we want. So this inclines each person to believe himself capable of prevailing in a struggle for something that can be held exclusively by only one person. Okay. Now, this equality of hope, when expressed in a situation without a common government, basically no police force, no system of justice, no prisons, this leads to everyone mistrusting one another. He calls this universal diffidence, mistrust. Diffidence means mistrust. This motivates persons to perform the old George W. Bush style preemptive strike against neighbors. Okay. In search of weapons of mass destruction, or these weapons of destruction. As past experience supports the inference that their neighbor is likely ill-disposed towards them and will, when presented with the opportunity, take their possessions. Right, so we have this society of mutual mistrust. There's enough people out there who would behave that way as to justify to a degree of probability the judgment that any arbitrarily encountered person is going to act that way. And in that circumstance, the police aren't there to protect you. You have a justification to perform preemptive strike. That's how Hobbes reasons. Okay, I know it doesn't sound very pleasant, but that doesn't make any difference. He's trying to persuade you to get out of the state of nature here. We'll get to it. Consequently, life takes the form of an endless quest of power after power. And by power, he means present store for the sake of meeting future needs. Okay, so it's not he's not referring to like exercising power in the sense of bashing people over the head. You're acquiring more and more present wealth, effectively, that'll guard against future needs. Oh, there I have it right there. So one can never be contented with how much one has at present with respect to food, land, military power, and security in the form of an absence of foreign enemies. The impulse then will be to increase one's advantage endlessly in each of these categories. So finally, some reliable minority of persons will take joy in conquest and seek war and rapine for the sake of vainglory. Okay, so we're familiar with that class of person. We've talked about them. So the state of nature and the state of war. So thus there are three motives in conflict in the state of nature. Motives to conflict. There are three motives to conflict in the state of nature. First, there's the desire for gain. Second, there's mistrust. Third, there's fear of one another. I'm sorry. Second, there's mistrust and fear of one another. Third, there's vainglory or pride. Okay, so we fight for the same things. We mistrust one another. And some persons in pride just fight for the sake of fighting, winning. The state of nature is therefore a war of all against all. But by war, he means something precise. He means the mutual acknowledgement over a tract of time of a will to fight. He doesn't mean continuous fighting over that time. But implied in his definition is that this will to fight will, as a matter of course, through the vagaries of experience, with necessity, be actualized in actual fighting. So the will to fight will be actualized in the will in actual fighting. So he's clear that in this situation there is not nor can there be justice. The reason is that without a common power established to overawe every party, there is nothing that can impose or establish the norms of just dealing that are part and parcel of political society. And this is why we can't talk about ethical theory and Hobbes apart from political philosophy, because you need to have a political state in order for there to be a distinction between justice and injustice. First of all, with respect to obeying and disobeying the law, but even with respect to extra-legal justice and injustice. We do owe one another a certain conduct, right? Apart from legality. So, the negative ideal. In a justly famous passage, Hobbes writes, "Whatsoever therefore is consequent to a time of war, where every man is enemy to every man, the same is consequent to the time wherein men live without other security than what their own strength and their own invention shall furnish them withal. In such condition there is no place for industry, because the fruit thereof is uncertain, and consequently no culture of the earth, no navigation, nor use of the commodities that may be imported by sea. No commodious building, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force. No knowledge of the face of the earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death. And the life of man, solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short." Okay, this passage has been quoted millions of times, Leviathan 13. So, you know, I call it the negative ideal because in your history courses, is there any period in history that looks like anything like this, where there's no agriculture, there's nothing, there's people running around killing one another? So generally speaking, no, right? You can't give ourselves any example of this historically. It's a negative ideal. This is what you want to avoid, okay? So how are you going to avoid this? He'll explain that. You avoid it with the compact. Today we call it a contract. Each person has an unlimited right of self-defense. This is how we begin. So you begin with a right, not a duty. So that flips ethical theory and political philosophy from Plato through Aquinas and beyond. Okay? So we studied Aquinas most recently. For Aquinas, the primary owner of rights is God. That means, in the next instance, you have duties towards God. Okay? And then God assigns rights to you and your fellow human beings. And that means you also have duties in light of God's will to one another. All right? For Hobbes, you don't start with a duty to God. You start with a right of self-defense. Another indication he's an atheist. So you begin with an unlimited right of self-defense. He has even of offense. This is because each has the right to increase the probability of his preservation in the state of nature. That we saw that earlier. People mistrust one another, and they have the right to strike first and strike hard. Right? I mean, it all sounds rather dismal, so that's why we want to get out of the state of nature. So the best way to accomplish this end is to seek peace with others, for your preservation. Put an end to the state of war of all against all. So third point, this takes the form of what will later be called the social contract. That was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's formulation, and his formulation ended up sticking. Those who enter the contract agree to obey laws that are established and enforced by another person or persons, and he's outside of the contract. That's the sovereign. It's important for Hobbes, this person himself, not be part of the contract. He's outside of it. So it's not an economic arrangement in which you're paying a sovereign for the service of protecting you. It's a distinctively political arrangement, not economic, in which you promise others to withhold or actually abandon the pretended right you have over their bodies in the final analysis, and they in turn will abandon their pretended right over your body, okay? Provided you promise and the other person's promise simultaneously to obey the sovereign. The sovereign's outside of the contract, and he's willing to be outside of the contract because he belongs to a certain psychological type that is relatively fearless. I mean, they experience fear too, but less than most people. And they really want to rule, and dominate, and oppress. And they're willing to suffer in order to enjoy that social status. So why would he agree to protect them, the sovereign? Well, we already saw why. He gets paid through taxes, and he can draft some of his subjects to conduct wars of conquest. That makes him even richer and increases his status. He's only really concerned with two things, and that's with wealth and reputation. Now, typically, maybe it's a third thing in there, and that's pleasure. Okay, monarchs historically have not exactly been a group of ascetics. Okay, and then some of them actually like just pushing people around just for the hay of it, and so they also like power. But that tends to be less frequent. Most persons are not interested in just crushing people for the sake of crushing them. I mean, they're out there. But they are interested in wealth, they are interested in status, and they are interested in pleasure. Now, what I said, my own observation, most people aren't interested in crushing people just for the hay of it. That perhaps is in tension with what Hobbes has said. He said, there are persons who just want to beat people, and these are the people who will become monarchs. He had a more direct experience with this sort of thing because he was in government, and Europe was. Well, he didn't have much interaction with the actual monarchs of his day. But he would say, okay, let's keep our eye on Hobbes and forget about me. He would say that the people who want to be monarch actually do want to dominate people. So power for them is important too. So let's just grant that point because we're trying to follow Hobbes here. Okay, so what we're looking for is a rational symbiosis of the sovereign and the people, based equally on the enlightened self-interest of each and their different aims, reciprocally supporting one another. And that's the essence of Hobbes' doctrine right there. Let's talk about ethical norms as promises backed by force. Now we're going to get into his ethics and how this kind of is an efflorescence or development of his political philosophy in a way. So again, there is no justice outside of the commonwealth. Justice exists only when the following conditions have been satisfied. You'd be more precise about this. First, a group of persons have promised to live in accordance with a set of laws promulgated by a sovereign authority. Second, some one person or body of persons has assumed that authority in a publicly recognizable way, in a manner linked to the reciprocal promise of those persons, or else through sheer imposition. Okay. Third, the sovereign enforces the laws so as to create a motivation to obey them strong enough to outweigh the desire to violate them. There actually has to be this kind of psychological fact about the subjects of the Commonwealth, namely that they are actually motivated because the Commonwealth has created within them sufficient fear of being punished, so as to motivate them to obey the laws. All right, so they made the promise. There was an active sovereign passing and enforcing laws, and he's doing it effectively enough that the persons who were party to the original exchange of promises, which is what a contract is, are motivated to uphold the contract. And then now we have justice. Okay. Thus, to violate a law under these circumstances is to break a promise one has made, but which promise is backed up by real force, inducing a real motivation to obey. So now there are extra-legal moral norms. Now, the status of extra-legal moral norms is less clear in Hobbes. These are moral norms, the violation of which is not punished by an act of the sovereign and his representatives, the police and the like, but it is normally subject to the sanction of political society. Right? So there's behavior which people are going to punish you for, even though you don't go to prison for it. This perhaps shows us the link to the sovereigns. Let's follow this out. The sovereign is a necessary condition for there being civil society at all. And he is likewise a necessary condition for there being justice. Now, morality has largely to do, well, significantly to do, largely is too strong a term here, significantly to do with extra-legal justice, that is, the conduct we owe one another, not in virtue of it being legislated, but in virtue of its being socially upheld, willed, and enforced, drop the word in there, albeit extra-legally, through the mechanisms of blame and social ostracism. So the violation of extra-legal social norms of politeness, deference, honoring superiors, etc., itself tears at the social fabric, right? You violate these things. It inches civil society towards a state of war. So we all can think of our own examples of, families falling apart because of some conduct on the part of one person in the family. It wasn't illegal, right? But it was enough to break the family into pieces. And we're all familiar with divorces and the conduct. It wasn't illegal, but it was immoral in a certain sense. There was a lack of, there was an injustice that was being done. Maybe injustices by both parties in different respects, right? So for this further reason, such violations are to be avoided, because even these extra-legal violations of justice tend to tear apart society. That's obvious in the case of the family. The family is a small society, and about half of them fall apart in this country when it comes to a first marriage. When it comes to a second marriage, about 2/3 of the second marriages fail as well. That's because they're already in the habit of, well, we can speculate as to the cause. One might be that they're already in the habit of getting a divorce when things get very unpleasant. Maybe they got divorced the first time because didn't have a clear image of what actually a marriage requires, which requires quite a lot of. You have to have a strong stomach, and you have to be able to suffer well if you're going to be married. I'm just going to tell you frankly right now. If you don't get married, then you don't have, well, I'm going to leave it at that because I don't want to get myself into trouble. So here we go. Let's talk to a critique of Hobbes. First, his metaphysics is merely postulated rather than being proved. Okay, so that's the first problem with Hobbes. There's no real proof of his atomism. Without supporting argumentation, his metaphysical framework appears arbitrary. This affects the rest of his philosophy because everything else rests upon his basic metaphysical presuppositions. See, he argues or appears, second point, he argues or appears to argue that the good is pleasure. This is what we call hedonism. So he's a hedonist. Good is pleasure. That's not to say that the pleasure is good, right? He says the good is pleasure. Those are two different things. It's one thing to say that all foxes are animals. It's quite something different to say all animals are foxes, right? He's saying if it's good, then it's pleasure. He's not saying that not immediately saying that if it's pleasure, then it's good, but we'll see. He still gets into trouble. Now, he arrives at this conclusion from the premise that there are no finalities in nature, right? That there are, for St. Thomas Aquinas, the fact that two zebras, like mommy and daddy zebra, produce a baby zebra, it's not an accident that what they produce is a zebra. It never comes out as an octopus or a tree or anything of that sort. There's always a zebra. And it grows up to be a zebra. So it doesn't suddenly change its shape and become a human being and go off and found a colony. That's because there are finalities in nature. There are ends that are being sought. And mommy and daddy zebra engage in the sexual act for the purpose of producing baby zebra. That's why that happens. And then you get a baby zebra sooner or later, right? We know it works because there are a bunch of zebras out there. All right. So for Hobbes, there are no finalities in nature. Okay. But he does argue that pleasure necessarily appears to be good to all who experience it. So pleasure is not a finality either, but it doesn't make any difference because we experience it. And when we experience it, we take it to be an end. You guys follow me? So this produces the following argument. All pleasure is good, or it's for all intents and purposes such as to impress itself upon everyone as good. I'm just going to abbreviate that by saying all pleasure is good. That means, you can't help but take it to be good. So all pleasure is good. But nothing else is good because there are no finalities in nature. If there were finalities, then you would have St. Thomas Aquinas' basic goods. Remember those? Those are gone. Each of those basic goods for Aquinas is a finality. Family, civil society, our relationship with God, these are basically religion, practical wisdom, theoretical wisdom, and biological life. All those are finalities. All that's gone. All we have now is pleasure. So if that's it, if pleasure is the only good left, then the good is pleasure. You guys follow? So we start, read it again. All pleasure is good, but there is no other good. So all good is, so the good is pleasure. Okay, that seems to be the background reasoning. I could be wrong about that. So a Hobbes scholar might quibble with me, but I think that is the background reasoning. So, and you're studying with me, not somebody else. So it's the interpretation I'm going to give you. The difficulty with this conclusion is that all decent people reject it. For who among you affirms that the pleasures of rape, murder, and torture are good? I'm willing to bet none of you. It is certain that some persons take pleasure in these activities. For example, down in High Risk in Cranston. But it is equally certain that most persons abhor these pleasures. Okay? Now, he could reformulate. So the idea that the good is pleasure rests upon the prior premise that the pleasure is good, and people just don't believe that. So now, maybe he could wiggle out of this. He could reformulate the first premise to state that some pleasures are good. So now it would say some pleasures are good, but nothing else is good, and therefore the good is pleasure, right? So he can say some pleasures are good and some are not good. So this way he can get out of sidestep the accusation that he's affirming that the pleasures of rape and murder and all these horrible things are good. But in doing so, he must explain the basis on which he makes a distinction, more in line with moral common sense. Now, it's moral common sense to draw a distinction between good and bad pleasures, right? So why is he making that distinction? What's the basis for that distinction? All right. Well, the basis would seem to be that there is a natural difference between activities that promote life, for example, cooperation, helping people, respecting property, and activities that destroy life, rape, murder, and torture. This restores life as a finality and a basic good. And analogous points may be made for the other basic goods, right? So the pleasure of destroying a family or destroying a political society just for the hay of it, right? These would be evil pleasures. You guys follow? You guys remember Ming the Merciless in Flash Gordon? He said that before he destroyed something, he'd like to torture it and play with it. Okay, so that would be a bad pleasure. And why would that be bad? Because he is destroying a basic good. And it's a basic good because it belongs to the very nature of human beings to organize in societies and live together in happiness. It's a finality. We're supposed to do that. We aim at it, right? Okay. So if he's going to, sidestep the original objection, then he can only do so by rehabilitating Aquinas' doctrine of basic goods, which you can basically find in Aristotle as well. Further critiques of Hobbes. Psychological egoism is contradicted by plain facts of loyalty, Now, remember, psychological egoism says it's impossible for you to be motivated by anything other than your own good. That is his position. But listen, people are loyal to one another. They sacrifice for friends and for family members. This is a fact. Father will throw himself under a train for his kid. Well, why would he do that if he's an ethical egoist? Doesn't make any sense. Some of you are thinking that's because he identifies with his kid. How can you identify with your kid if you're an ethical egoist? If you're an ethical egoist, all that matters is you. You can't identify with anyone else if you're an ethical egoist, yet people do. That's the whole question. If you can identify with other people and they're good and take their good as your good, you're not an ethical egoist. Okay, that's the end of that. So psychological egoism implies that love is an illusion. Ethical egoism implies that if one has succumbed to the illusion, it is a moral duty to dispel it. Okay. So with the dismissal of all love, there vanishes with it all friendship, goodwill, patriotism, and noble sacrifice. Marriage is reduced to mutual cooperation and self-preservation, with children as a kind of accidental byproduct. Further, all virtue is to be rejected in favor of calculated self-interest in accordance with the golden rule. All right, so you have to ask yourself whether you could live with all that. So basically, you eviscerate friendship, goodwill, patriotism, and noble sacrifice. You brutalize marriage, and you liquidate virtue. And in its place, you put forward calculated self-interest. And there's always somebody out there who pumps his arms and says, "Right on, man." But you got to be aware of if you're attracted to Hobbes, you weren't quite aware of the implications. Those are the implications. So, third point is nominalism relies upon relations of similarity. Remember, there are no common natures, just common names. That's nominalism. But that relies upon relations of similarity, which have as their limit the relation of identity. So, if two horses are similar to one another, that means they're pretty close to being identical, and you can't even think, but they're not. But you can't even think of similarity independently of identity, and thus similarity requires identity, right? You can't separate the two. So mere similarity of structure depends upon the possibility of identity of structure, like two identical twin horses. And identity of structure implies formal universality. Guys follow? You can have the same, like when at a factory they do this. They produce one dinner fork after another in the exact same shape. See, there's a very slight difference at the atomic level. Who cares? It's still possible for those two shapes at the atomic level to be exactly the same. It's not very probable, but it's possible. So it's possible for there to be two forks of exactly the same shape. Okay, exactly the same shape. Then there's universality, and nominalism is false. Okay, so now we can look at two horses, however different they are. We can conclude that, as a matter of fact, there is a universal there, horseness, which is being instantiated in each instance of that species horse. Likewise for two trees, likewise for two human beings. So nominalism doesn't work. Now, what about his contractarianism? So Hobbes' contractarianism, in social contract, right, is conditioned on private advantage, which vanishes when the sovereign orders a man to die for him, right? You only enter into the contract if it's advantageous to you and increases the probability of comfortable self-preservation. Now, the sovereign orders you to go on a suicide mission. And the only rational thing to do, right? The only thing to do in light of enlightened self-interest is to say, "Oh yeah, sure," and then get out of there and don't do anything of the sort. Move to a different country, right? So all patriotic sacrifice vanishes, but double dealing, disloyalty, and betrayal are elevated as rational and good. So these defects are very severe. What then is the appeal of Hobbes? So two things come to mind. First, his philosophy gratifies a desire for rebellion, self-assertion, and pride. Second, it offers overly simple solutions to life's complexities. And I should say, third, he does touch on some kind of truth. His reductive materialism serves as a kind of X-ray machine, exposing some of the inner motivations of human beings, right? He does seem to capture something about the baseness of our species. My objection has been our species, as base as it is, it's not nothing but base. It's not nothing but baseness. There is nobility. There is sanctity. There are saintly people. There are persons who sacrifice for one another, so he goes too far. So the upshot of his system is that whatever his intentions, the individual is elevated above the community. Another Hobbist innovation, so to speak, with following Machiavelli. Virtue and holiness are sidelined in favor of material values. Religion is reduced to being a servant of public order. Glorifying God in worship and obedience is now instrumentalized to self-preservation. So in Rhode Island, we're 60% nominally Catholic, and the other 20% are Christian. There's Hindus and everything here. So if you don't like the ring of that, the Hobbes is not going to work for you. If you don't like taking a religion and reducing it to a mere instrument of the gratification of the ego, that's not going to work for you. Finally, Hobbes, following Machiavelli, extends the reanimalization of man. The animalization of the human being would be extended further by Darwin, Marx, and Freud. And we are living through the toxic combination of their three doctrines, not to mention others, but particularly those. I guess a little bit worse than that, but that's bad enough. All right, folks, so that's what I have to say. Thomas Hobbes, hope you enjoyed that lecture, and I'll put up a journal for you. Be well.